And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Kim Strassel, an author, a commentator, a journalist, and a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. She started her career with the Journal in Brussels, and then in London. She moved to New York in 1999, and soon after joined the Journal's editorial page. In 2014, she received the Bradley Prize. She is a regular on the Sunday political talk shows, including CBS's Face the Nation, Fox News Sunday, and Meet the Press on NBC. She also appears frequently on the Journal editorial report on Fox News on Sundays as well. Her book, The Intimidation Game, has been given to all of WPC's top sponsors and Pillar Society members and supporters, and will be available at the Barnes & Noble book table just outside the West Ballroom doors after our event tonight. Kimberley is a Northwest native, originally from Oregon. She earned her degree from Princeton in Public Policy and International Affairs. It is my honor to welcome Kimberley Strassel.
Hello, Washington Policy Center. Everybody having fun? So one of the great things about being one of the last speakers of the night is that you get to respond to a couple of the other things that have happened already. So first of all, I want to give my congratulations to Tessa and to Dan for their awards. Impressive. I wanted to point out to Kemper that for those of us who are rednecks and we grew up listening to country music from the time we were in diapers, his description of country music songs is partly correct, but there is another definition of how you categorize a country music song. Raise your hand if you've ever listened to David Allan Coe. Oh, there you go. Okay, so then you know that the perfect country and western song always references mama, trains, trucks, prison, and getting drunk. I heard John talking about his child and early political experience there. Of course, all of us in this room who have children, you've had to have that discussion or debate in your mind about how you introduce them to politics without necessarily inculcating them. I have a little tip for any of you out there who have young children or who are thinking of having children. So in my household, we don't actually say you need to be a conservative, you need to be a liberal. Instead, we try to impart lessons by practice. So for instance, in my home, every day when my children are good and they eat their dinner well, they get a treat, they get a dessert. But every night, they have to give part of their dessert to me. And I call that the mommy tax. And we have fascinating discussions about taxes around the dinner table that revolve around the idea of, what did you ever do to deserve part of my treat? And why do I have to give this to you when you haven't done anything to earn it? And I knew this was working a couple of years ago. We turned on the first Donald Trump-Hillary Clinton debate. And we're watching it, and my youngest, who was 5 at the time, she looked up and she goes, boy, that guy's really scary. And I said, yeah, he's a little unusual. And the older one instantly said, yeah, but who wants more taxes? And I said, she does. And he goes, man, if I could vote, I'd vote for Donald Trump. So there you go. One last word, Joe Lieberman was incredibly gracious to me. That is an extraordinary man. And if we had more people like that in Washington, we would be very fortunate. And with him, what you see is what you get. I have known him since I first went to Washington. Not only was it an honor to get to come and talk to you tonight, but the sealer on the invitation was seeing that I would get to see Joe again. I'd not seen him in 5 years, and he is just an extraordinary person. So we were all lucky to hear him tonight. One thing just to start and get it out of the way, obviously I do not look like Ben Carson. For starters, I have a lot more hair than he does. I also, these hands, I don't know however many of you remember the extraordinary commercial he ran when he was running for president, the These Hands commercials. These hands have never performed neurosurgery on a child, which is a good thing. I've wanted to try it before on my own kids, but I've never actually done it. But this is all by way of saying that I'm clearly not Ben Carson, even though I know everybody was very much looking forward to hearing from him tonight. I hope to at least be an adequate replacement for the evening. No, thank you. It's in fact a great honor. It's remarkable. I have now, over the series of the past 3 weeks, been able to address everyone from the Washington Policy Center from the east to the west coast of Washington. 2,500 of you all together, and it is my deep honor to get to do that. I get invited to a lot of speeches to talk in a lot of different places, a lot of them, to trade groups, big organizations, universities. I say this from the bottom of my heart. These are the organizations that I care most about coming to visit, because what you do matters so much more than pretty much anything else that happens in the country. We spend way too much, no, it's true. We spend way too much time focusing on what happens in Washington, D.C. The government that is most responsive is the government that is closest to you, and the organizations that work to make sure that that is the case are the ones that have the hardest jobs but the biggest rewards. So I applaud all of you in the room. So the organizers thought it would be an interesting and a good format if what we did to start with is that I took a couple of questions from some of those Pillar Society members that you heard about earlier from Greg, and then spend the bulk of my time after that talking a little bit about the Mueller Russian investigation, which has been a very big topic for me, something that I think we should all be focused a lot on. It sounds as though we're actually going to hear something from Bob Mueller, at least after the election, so it might be a good time to take another look at that. But for now, in keeping with this format, let's go to the backstage, because I think there is a question to begin with.
Well, good evening, Kimberly, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Kate Lampson. I am the Vice Chair of the Washington Policy Center, Young Professionals Advisory Board, and a Tri-Cityan. My question to you this evening has 3 parts. What do you think will be the legacy of the controversy of the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination? How do you think it will affect the next appointment to the court? And what impact do you see it having on the midterm elections?
Thank you. Well, I think obviously, look, my big concern, and I wrote about this at the time, was that what would happen if in fact he was voted down, okay? That to me would have been the very scary precedent that would set in this country. That you would have essentially given your commendation and your sign-off to all the tactics that were used in this, to have essentially written off due process, to have essentially written off the idea that you are innocent until proven guilty, to have agreed with a completely circus-like Senate nomination and confirmation process. Luckily, that's not what happened in the end, and we owe a great deal of thanks to Susan Collins, who not only stood up and did the right thing, but gave a very good argument for why she was doing it as well, too. I think, look, to get to the midterm question next, because I think this is very important, we don't know who's going to win this midterm. Look, I think it's very clear at this point that probably the Republicans will keep the Senate, but the House is now coming down to a question of 5 seats either direction. It's very close. And while we don't know the ultimate outcome, I will tell you this. We can, at this point, a month on from the Kavanaugh hearings, say that politically, at least, the Democratic tactics during this were a complete and utter disaster for them politically. Because a month ago, we've heard all this talk about a blue wave. They were close to having that happen. And a month ago, they were still in the potential territory of taking the U.S. Senate. That's not going to happen anymore. And that is a direct correlation to what happened to Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Dianne Feinstein, the way that this was jumped on the nomination, and what people saw on their screens. And so I think that that should be, in terms of whether or not this happens again in future nominations, I would like to hope that that has been internalized a little bit, that this is not a winner in American politics, and we're not talking about necessarily the fringes on either end, but for the mass middle, what they saw there was not an example of civility. It's not an example of how we run things judicially or justice-wise in our country, and that it would not be to any political party's favor to try and something like that again. So that would be what I would be hopeful for in terms of what comes next. Do we have another one? I think another question.
Good evening, Kimberly. I'm Don Stafford. I'm a proud member of the Pillar Society and also a member of the Eastern Washington Advisory Board. My question tonight is twofold. The first is, what priorities should the President and Congress focus on around deregulation? And then the second part is, which areas could have the greatest impact on U.S. economic growth, and how does that compare to the impact of the tax cuts?
Yeah, so I'm one of those, you may not hear this view from a lot of people. I actually fundamentally believe that if you look at what has helped the economy the most over the last 2 years, obviously the tax cut matters. We care about tax cuts deeply, especially those of us in this room who care about free markets, free people. But I fundamentally believe that the deregulatory efforts that the federal government has taken have been even more important in terms of business investment, and what comes next than even the tax cut. And I don't know, this is worth looking at. If any of you in the room have never taken a look at this, another worthy think tank, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, they put out something every year. It's actually called the 10,000 Commandments, which is, of course, a reference to how many federal regulations we have these days. And they found that last year, regulation cost the United States $1.9 trillion. $1.9 trillion. And that's a conservative estimate, by the way. Excuse me, I've had a cold. I have 3 children. Just to give you a sense of what that actually stands for, that's the equivalent of $15,000 per household in a tax. It's more than the average family spends on food, clothing, and transportation. And it's more than the IRS's total take of corporate and individual income taxes every year. That's how big the regulatory tax is on the United States. And so I think what's really important about the deregulatory efforts that have been taken is not just the costs that they've been removing from society, but that they also provide something that's just very important for the business climate, which is certainty. It matters, too, in particular in certain industries, because as we know, those regulators out there, sometimes they have an incredibly disparate impact on certain different sectors of the economy. So you release some of that, and it lets the flow go out all the way down through the rest of the chain. But also, I would point out that this is unprecedented, and we should be reveling in this, because, to be honest, people, I'm not ever sure it will happen again. You know, if you think about it, look, I've been around for a long time, writing about politics for a long time, and what we have is we'll have Democratic presidents that come in and they put a whole bunch of regulation on the economy. And then we have Republican presidents who come in and they'll deregulate some, but there are certain areas where they just really won't touch because they feel as though it would make them look bad if they went down that road, right? And I mean, coming from the Northwest, where I grew up in a logging community in Oregon. Environmental regulations are a very good example. You know, even George W. Bush, he did deregulate some, but when he put his EPA administrator in and others, it was certainly out there that, well, you know, we don't want to look as though we're anti-environmental, so we'll just leave a bunch of those regulations on the book. We won't touch them. Donald Trump doesn't care. And, you know, that's just a really unusual situation. Yeah. We have this GOP Congress that's used the Congressional Review Act to revoke at least 14 major rules that were passed in the waning days of the Obama administration. President Trump actually withdrew us from the Paris Climate Treaty. Can you think of any other person in government that would ever have withdrawn the United States from a treaty that was considered so, was the kind of happy child of everything that everyone who believes in good things believed in the world, and he nonetheless withdrew us from that treaty. All in all, by the end of this year, the administration is on track to kill or withdraw or delay close to 2,000 regulations. I know, it's incredible. And in terms of what comes next, look, a lot of the bigger ones are obviously done now. Cap and trade, the waters of the United States rule, some of these other things that were such a threat hanging over the economy. So what you're going to see in the next 2 years, I think, are a drilling down within each agency, a more very specific focus on education policy, on housing and urban development policy. Also, this is really important, and it gets overlooked. Don McGahn, who was the president's general counsel, by the way, his last day was last week. He's gone. He's owed by everyone a round of applause, not just for his role in picking some of the Supreme Court nominees that we had and seeing them through, but also this was a guy, he worked in federal government himself. He was a federal election commissioner. And he came out of that job with an absolutely bitter view of the power of the federal bureaucracy. And every one of these judges that he has picked and chosen and helped put on the circuit courts or on the Supreme Court are fundamentally, they're good conservative justices, but also they have been trained their whole life in administrative law and in the separation of powers, and in making sure that the executive branch and its bureaucracy is not allowed to run roughshod over the statutes that our legislatures have actually passed. And yeah. And a sidebar to that, and I know this for a fact because I've talked to him about this, is that when he came in, he made sure that the general counsels of every single one of the cabinet positions, cabinet offices in Washington, D.C., whether it be the EPA, whether it be Health and Human Services, that he got a general counsel whose goal was not just to roll back some of these regulations, but to internally, and it's not sexy, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but to internally attempt to revamp the entire structure of these agencies from the inside out to make it a million times harder in future for that bureaucracy to continue creating rules that are outside of statutory law. So that's going to be an important thing to watch for as well going forward. There's another one?
Yes, there is another one.
Okay, hi.
Kim, my name is Heidi Stanley, and I am Vice Chair and Treasurer of Washington Policy Center Board. And question is, here in Washington State, we have no income tax. And in fact, our state revenues have increased dramatically from about $28 billion just 10 years ago to projected $50 billion for this next budget cycle. You know where I'm going.
Yeah.
However, we have cities like Seattle passing city income taxes and others arguing for more state taxing mechanisms such as carbon tax, capital gains, etc. So my question, how do you see tax reform and other federal changes impacting the policy agenda at the state level?
So I know maybe some people in this room are not going to like this answer. In my mind, one of the most important things that happened as a part of tax reform was the elimination or changes in the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction. And I know for people who live in higher tax states, that is going to hurt their bottom line. But in my mind, it is the only way you ever get state tax reform, okay? Because the problem with SALT is that states were able to raise their own taxes and in essence mask the amount of money that they were asking their own citizens to pay because they were allowed to deduct it from their federal tax forms. Now that that is gone, folks in states like Washington or New Jersey or New York, They're going to feel much more fully the consequences of the spending that their local legislators do. And hopefully that will inspire a movement in those states to require their state legislatures to do something about overspending and high tax rates, which hurt economies, obviously, and do a lot of other damage. An interesting little thing I've been thinking about, and I haven't actually figured out exactly what the answer is to, but it's an interesting example. A lot of people don't know this, but I actually split my time between Washington, D.C. and Alaska. And we had an interesting fight. We are having an interesting fight up in Alaska at the moment. The current governor, so I don't know if any of you know this, don't necessarily take this as an invitation to move to Alaska. We like how few people live there right now. But if you're up there, you get a check every year from the government for actually living in the state of Alaska. It's called the Permanent Fund Dividend, and it's every citizen's sort of recompense for the state oil and gas revenues. Every year it runs about $2,000. It goes to every woman, man, and child in the state of Alaska if you've been there for a year. We had a governor that when oil revenues fell in the last couple of years, and it really blew a hole in the state budget, instead of deciding to cut spending, which would have been the appropriate thing to do in face of such a big problem, he decided to cut the permanent fund dividend. And Bill Walker just withdrew from the race because his approval ratings were hovering around 15%. And I mean, I think the point I'm trying to make here is what's unique about that situation is in that 99% of states, when you have overspending, people don't really feel the pain until later when the tax hikes come. Alaska has this interesting and fascinating mechanism in which everyone's already due an aspect of state revenue, and then there's an accountability mechanism placed on politicians so that if they cut that in any way and overspend, they are held accountable. It's something for everyone to think about there in the United States. It really ought to be Americans' money first, the state residents' money first, and there ought to be a punishment on politicians if they take it from you. You ought to have it in your hands, and they ought to have to justify taking back out of it instead of the other way around. So it's something to think about, but I think that's going to be one of the most lasting aspects of this if that provision, the SALT provision, remains. One other tiny thing that I think matters a lot too, because it gets to a bigger thing. We have an enormous opportunity at the moment. There is a federal government that is ready, willing, and able for the first time in 8-10 years to work and give waivers to the states, allow them any opportunities they want to craft new programs the way they want to, work with the federal government, get out from underneath the federal thumb. This is an opportunity nobody should be missing out on. And Washington State has an opportunity to do that too. So.
The last one, promise.
Last one, okay.
My name is Kent Clausen, and I am a proud member of the Pillar Society, and I encourage all of you to join us. My question, Kimberley, surrounds one of the top issues of the Trump administration, namely the Mueller investigation. This investigation, of course, was supposed to investigate potential collusion with Russia to meddle in the 2016 election. Your columns have called for, you've actually brought into question many of the tactics and the aspects of this investigation, and may have long-term impacts on how people view whether or not justice truly is blind. You've also, in your columns, encouraged President Trump to unveil the secrecy in this investigation and to, and I've called for the declassification of many of the documents underlying that investigation. We would love to hear your insight into this whole matter in terms of what you might think its outcome would be and what the tactics have been here to date.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll try not to go on too long. This is my hobby horse. But I know we're running a little bit late tonight. If you'd have asked me of all the things that have happened over the last 2 years, and there has been obviously so much, tax reform, deregulation, the Kavanaugh nomination, if you'd asked me if I'd been spending most of my time delving into the world of FISA warrants and unmaskings and dossiers and Russian disinformation and former MI6 intelligence agents and opposition research firms, I would have told you that you were smoking too much of the marijuana that is now so readily available in the United States. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a very bad spy novel, like a really bad spy novel. It's crazy. I will tell you, this is not a joke. It is so weird in Washington right now that there are people, and these are not folks that walk around with tin hats on their head or anymore. These are respectable, reputable people in Washington. If they work outside of the government, they will only call me on an encrypted app. And if they work inside the government, they will only call me on a secure phone. As crazy as that sounds, it says something, and I don't necessarily blame them, because the point I think of that is that when you get to a world where you believe that your FBI is doing things that are completely out of bounds, then you can begin to believe that anything is possible, and it's a little bit scary. And I think that's my biggest concern and frustration right now with most of the media, and I think the biggest disservice that they have done to the country has been generally proceeding from the fact that not only are they not going to cover what the FBI did and the Department of Justice did, but they're going to begin from the premise in almost everything that they do right that there is something somehow unpatriotic even questioning what the FBI or the DOJ did. And that's nuts, okay? I mean, just look back, and again, I have a great deal of respect for the average men and women who every day go out and protect us, and they put their lives on the line and they defend this country, who work in the FBI and the Department of Justice. But at the higher up levels, obviously, the Department of Justice and the FBI are completely subject to the same levels of corruption or ineptitude that any other government agency are subject to. And in fact, we ought to be more worried about that fact, because when the FBI and the DOJ mess up, they have more power to do bad things to people than anybody else in government does, which is precisely why we should be putting more scrutiny on them than just about any other agency that's out there. And we have an obligation to do that. And I think you've stepped back and you look at what they've done. I don't think you even need to walk into rabbit holes down any of these twists and turns about this Russian meeting with this particular person and that person's name and all of the confusing details. Just step back from 30,000 feet and ask yourself this: if this statement sounds correct to you, that in 2016, our federal law enforcement, the FBI, not only believed itself entitled to, but then actively initiated investigations into both of the sitting campaigns running for the presidency of the United States. If that sounds to you like a normal thing to happen, an appropriate thing to happen, this is not the United States. There are rules, and in fact, if you go back and you look, the Department of Justice, every 4 years, it puts out a memo in which it describes exactly the behavior that you're meant to adhere to in election periods if you are in the FBI or the DOJ. And it stresses the importance of having sensitivity to politics and to not in any way engaging in any activity that looks as though you may be influencing an election. Well, let's take a look at how they actually looked at these two investigations. Look at the Clinton investigation. Now, in my mind, in a better and more noble world, when Hillary Clinton was actually discovered to have had a private server and to have had classified information on that server, and then to have deleted the information in order to keep it from the public, and the entire scandal that followed, she would have done the appropriate thing and simply stepped down from running for the presidency. But that's not how the Clintons roll. It's never really how the Clintons roll. So I think it's probably fair that the FBI had to conduct some sort of investigation into what happened, albeit with a priority on efficiency and speed and clarity. Instead, we know, if you look at what we found out so far, from the text messages that continue to come out from two FBI agents, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, as well as from the draft statements that Congress has reviewed about what the FBI was doing, as well as from the FBI's own clear actions, politics absolutely played a role in an aspect in that probe in ways that both helped and, I would point out, harmed Mrs. Clinton. We know that the former deputy director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, had a wife who was running for office and who was obtaining direct financial support from Clinton associates, but he did not recuse himself. We know that Mr. Strzok, who was the lead investigator on the case, had a discussion with Mrs. Page about how many agents the FBI should even put on this case. She wrote to him at one point, and I quote to you, "One more thing, Clinton might be our next president, and the last thing you need us going in there loaded for bear. Do you think she's really going to remember or care that it was more the Department of Justice or than the FBI?" I mean, these are the notes that were going back and forth between people. Of course, politics played a role in this. We know that from those texts that President Obama was apparently being updated on the case despite his claim that he wasn't involved. We know that the two agents scoffed at the news that Loretta Lynch was recusing herself from deciding from whether or not to bring prosecution. One text between the two reads, "Wow, that's a real profile in courage since she knows that no charges will ever be brought against Mrs. Clinton." We know how the draft statements exonerating her in that infamous press conference changed over time. They initially contained the somewhat bombshell information that Mrs. Clinton had communicated directly with the president on her server, putting those conversations at risk to hacking from most of our foreign enemies. That reference to the president was later changed to a senior official. It was later deleted from the draft altogether. We know that the original statement said that Mrs. Clinton was guilty of gross negligence, which under statute is a crime. And again, it was later changed to extreme carelessness, which carries no charges. And we know the entire statement was drafted before the FBI had even bothered to interview Mrs. Clinton, which didn't come until the very end of the process, which was completely out of sync with such investigations. And then, of course, there was the press conference itself, in which Mr. Comey entirely broke the chain of command, decided to unilaterally absolve Mrs. Clinton from any charges, broke with Justice Department prosecutors, didn't ask them for their opinions. He doesn't get to make that call, and in the recent Inspector General report from Michael Horowitz from the Department of Justice, he pointed out that Jim Comey was guilty of, quote, insubordination and, quote, of hiding things from his superiors. These are not statements you ever want associated with the head of your Federal Bureau of Investigation. You know, and all of this, by the way, is a bit of child's play compared to what happened with the FBI's handling of the Trump investigation. In the late spring of 2016, an opposition research firm named Fusion GPS was hired by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee to dig up dirt on Mr. Trump. It in turn contracted a former MI6 Russian specialist to look into the president's ties into Russia. Christopher Steele put together a series of memos with pretty crazy accusations. I think the best description I've ever heard of them came from South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy, who said that they were like reading something out of the National Enquirer. By the way, I have read them. If you have not read them, I think that that's actually a charitable description of what they're like. Steele nonetheless took this salacious document to the FBI, and the FBI swallowed it whole, which right there has to make you wonder about the FBI and its competence, okay? Because here's a guy who used to work for MI6, but he's been out of spy circles at this point for 7 long years, and he's a gun for hire. And he's working for the Clinton campaign. And he shows up at the FBI, and he claims to have unraveled an international conspiracy in which the Republican candidate is colluding with the Russians to win the elections. And he claims to have done this from his telephone sitting in London, because, by the way, he never traveled to Russia during all of this, and that somehow he got all this dirt despite the fact that every other Western intelligence agency with every spy tool available to them in the entire modern world somehow missed. And the FBI is like, oh yeah, cool, okay, give it to us, we'll move on that. I mean, it was crazy. We now know for a fact that they used this document in their application to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to get a warrantless wiretap, or a wiretap on Carter Page. They renewed that application 4 times. They didn't tell the court that the source of this document was a rival presidential campaign, and they did not tell it that it was a product of an opposition research firm. They instead presented their source as wise and credible and with no political motivation. The FBI duped the FISA court. And they also didn't tell the court that this guy had gone out and, working for the Clinton campaign, had briefed all of the press in complete violation of FBI rules. And even when the FBI did find out that he'd done that and they'd fired him, they never went back to the court and told him that this guy had become uncredible. They continued to present him as credible in front of the court. There's a lot more, obviously. We could go on for a very long time. There's the role of Obama officials and Clinton officials on the political side of this, pushing within government with this dossier and the actions that were taken. Unmaskings, the leaks of highly classified information that were all designed to hurt an incoming administration. And by the way, not that we can get the answers to all of these questions, because to this day, the Department of Justice continues to flout subpoenas that have been issued to them by the Congress. Rod Rosenstein, just today, the Deputy Attorney General, refused yet again his meeting that he was meant to have with House investigators was delayed yet again. So we are never going to find this out from the Department of Justice itself. They have circled the wagons. If Democrats take over the House, by the way, this fall, we will also see an end to any investigation that continues to look into it. It will be done there. So at this point, and to get to the questioner's question, the only way we will ever find out what happened in 2016 with any speed or in any point at which it would still matter is for the president to declassify these documents. Yeah. And he really does need to, because this is important, and I'm going to finish up here. I know it's getting a bit late, but it's so important. You know, I think those of us in this room, if you do believe in free markets, you do believe in free people. The free people part in particular, this is incredibly scary. Everyone should care about this a great deal. I would be just as appalled about this and be just as dogged in reporting about this if this had been the George W. Bush administration doing this to an incoming Obama administration. Could you imagine? I mean, the only difference is that the rest of the press would actually be appalled with me, which isn't happening at the moment. But it's imperative that we get the real answers about what happened here, importantly so that we can go out, figure out what went wrong, and then make sure that it never happens again. Because we cannot live in a country in which stuff like this happens. So I'm going to finish just one little story, which doesn't have to actually have anything, thank the God, to do with the FBI or the Department of Justice, but rather you had that lovely piece up there about Charles Krauthammer, and I just have a little story to relate to you because I knew Charles pretty well. But this was about 11 years ago, and I was living in Washington, and George W. Bush was president at the time, and he used to have a crowd of us conservative writers come in for these off-the-record briefings that he would do with him. And it was usually me and a lot of men, because there aren't a lot of female conservative writers anywhere in Washington or elsewhere. But I would go in with the crowd of people you often see in these newspapers. And on this particular occasion, I was heavily pregnant with my second child. I mean, I looked like the USS Enterprise. I was just enormous. And I walked in there, and I was 10 days off from delivery. And because I was one of the only women that ever got invited in, I got sat right next to the president. And all the rest of these columnists are sitting around the table. I think we were in the Roosevelt room. But the president looks over, and you can tell George W. Bush was actually a little nervous, okay? Because I was like sitting out here from the table. And he tried to look all cool, but he looked over, he's like, so, when you do? And you know, he's kind of a joker, and I had decided to joke back with him, and so I looked at him with all seriousness, and I said, oh, Mr. President, I was due a week ago. and he kind of looked a little twitchy, and you could tell he was putting his hand up to like find out if the White House doctor was in residence. And suddenly you start hearing all these columnists, which just made me laugh because they're all men. They start making their little comments around the table, and they're all just completely in keeping with their personalities. So if you know some of these personalities, Michael Barone goes, you know, he's the statistician. He starts giving a complete account of every woman who's ever had a baby in the White House, complete with years and when it happened and which president and who the White House doctor was at that time and how the birth had gone, and he's giving all these historical details. David Brooks is there from the New York Times, and he's all worried about whether or not I have appropriate health care and do I have a good nanny going forward and everything else. And all of a sudden I hear this voice on the other side of the room, and Charles Krauthammer says, well, don't worry about it, because remember, I'm a doctor. I can deliver it. And even better, this is when Bill Kristol pipes up, and he's not the most tactful of men, and he goes, what are you going to do it with, your teeth? So, this is my memory with some of my favorite men in Washington, D.C. They are all good people. Charles will be very much missed. He had a most beautiful sense of humor, and he was a very good man. And I'm glad that you have been able to hear him on occasion, and I thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you.